challenge that a school faces is that all the momentum's moving in that direction. You know, and the worry being that schools will have a very tough time of stepping out of that. And so the fact that they're more or less being forced within it, then how do they respond?
I was one of 3 advisors for Race to the Top in Massachusetts, helping them with their application for Race to the Top. And one of the reasons Massachusetts did not get the application the first time round is that most people agree, or did agree at the time, that the Massachusetts curriculum and standards are actually more rigorous than those that were being prescribed federally. And so Massachusetts for quite some time believed that in order to meet Race to the Top criteria, it would actually have to lower the quality and lower the standards of its curriculum. And the question is in order, once you're approaching a standard by saying some people actually have to lower their quality, once you say you want all schools to be the same, and so the good schools have to start to come down and to scale down, you're not having standards, you're having standardization, where everybody becomes the same. And that begins to sound to me like most people's stereotype of socialism. And I'm not happy with that stereotype, actually.
It's fascinating. So why aren't you happy with that?
That everybody's the same, that everybody does the same thing, that everybody learns the same, because it doesn't recognize the glory of diversity in all the different kinds of communities we are, in all the different ways we learn, in all the kind of learning that we have. We are evaluating a magnificent project in Ontario in Canada now called Essential for Some Good for All. Essential for Some Good for All. And it is that in order to help students who are identified as having special educational needs, you have to change the whole school. You have to recognize that every learner has special needs. And some of those needs are more acute than others, not that these kids are standardized and these kids need something extra or something different. So it's really the glory of human diversity, which does not mean that we do what we like, that everybody makes it up as they go along. It means you find coherence through community, through networks, and through a common vision or dream of where you want to be as a nation. And then just ways to check, like the Finns, just how you're doing over time as you move along.
You know, it's interesting because when you look at, I mean, there's lots of different origins towards the standards movement, but one of those historical origins, you know, even when you look at the creation of the Department of Education in the U.S., was to protect the civil rights of students.
Yes.
So that there was a larger entity saying, you know, your standards actually work for all kids, or you know what you're doing works for all kids. And so is there a, I mean, that now obviously we're to a much different level of standards. But with that strong localized control and the ownership, the beauty of diversity, are there different ways that we could assess and assure that traditionally disadvantaged kids are also being held to high standards, even if it is so distinctly localized?
Well, again, the issue here, I think, is through goals, through community, through interaction, through tools, and of course, which is the classic American solution, when in doubt, bring in a lawyer. And that's why we deal with special needs the way we do. And the moment you bring in a lawyer, you can get a huge entire system being shifted, sometimes because of a case of one.
Right.
And I think,
that's
you know,
fascinating.
everybody would say Brown versus Board was a really good thing to do, and I'd agree with that. But that's not the end of something, that's the beginning.
Right.
That's the beginning of something. One of the results of Brown versus Board was that all the white folks moved out to the suburbs.
Yeah.
And we had separate districts dealing with separate kinds of cases. It was not solved by legislation.
Right.
Legislation should have been a spark for other kinds of conversations, other kinds of interactions.
I mean, the hardest question always comes down to the implementation piece, the reality of the implementation. And so, you know, even just before you, I was speaking with Deborah Childs Bowen, and and we're talking about equity issues. And so yes, there's the ideal of where an educator should be deep within their soul, but there's the reality of momentum and me kind of being in the way of that. And so to be able to get to the fourth way, to the ideal of what's there, realistically, how do you get a system actually shifting that direction? And so it's that initial moment of movement. How do you get the initial moment of movement towards ideally what we know should be in place?
I'm totally interested in implementation.
Yeah.
Committed to it as not. So the fourth way is not something that magically emanates from the pores, but the second and third ways really believe that you make things happen by standards and standardizations, through assessment and evaluations, and through achievement. The fourth way really believes a lot more, that the answers are less in standards and assessment and achievement and testing, and more in, first of all, leadership, secondly, community, and third, learning. And you need to pay attention to those other things, standards, testing, and so on. But those are secondary. Your first thing are your goals of where you want to be, lining up and preparing and developing and connecting your leadership behind that, building community of people who are committed and have the capacity, the capability, and using that to focusing on learning for all students, diverse students that meets them where they are and moves them forward over time. And so these are both about implementation, but they're fundamentally different visions of how we bring it about. And one thing we say in the fourth way, somewhat mischievously, is leadership is the afterthought of educational reform.